This is the story of a quiet black homeowner in Georgia who just wanted peace on his own land, until a group of imposters posing as HOA cops tried to force him out with fake papers, cheap badges, and threats. What they didn't know was that this man had friends who didn't scare easy, friends who had once worn the trident of the Navy SEALs. What began as a knock at the door would unravel into a battle for dignity, community, and justice that no one on that street would ever forget. Calvin Brooks had lived in the small Georgia town of Maplewood for nearly a decade, and for most of that time, he had kept to himself. His modest ranch-style house sat at the edge of a cul-de-sac lined with oak trees, Spanish moss dangling like tired curtains from the branches. The property wasn't big by any means, but it had a garage Calvin had built with his own hands, a vegetable garden tilled each spring, and a porch where he could sip coffee at dawn. For Calvin, a 48-year-old mechanic with broad shoulders and weathered palms, the house represented more than just shelter. It was the first place where he felt settled, after years of bouncing between jobs and neighborhoods. His father, a Vietnam veteran, had taught him the value of discipline and perseverance, and those lessons had carried Calvin through hard seasons. He didn't need luxury. He didn't need recognition. He just wanted peace. Peace, however, was the very thing that seemed most elusive these days. The arrival of the cops. It started one Tuesday morning in late spring. The air was thick with humidity, and Calvin was in his garage repairing an old carburetor when he heard the crunch of tires on his gravel driveway. He wiped his hands on a rag, stepped out, and froze. Two men stood at the edge of his property, wearing navy blue shirts with patches stitched to their sleeves. The patches bore the letters HOA Security Division, flanked by what looked like a badge. Their belts carried radios and handcuffs, and one had a baton clipped to his hip. Calvin raised an eyebrow. "Morning. Can I help you?" The taller of the two, a pale man with a shaved head, pulled a clipboard from under his arm. "You Calvin Brooks?" "I am." "We're with Maplewood Estates HOA Enforcement. You've got violations, sir. Several. We're here to serve notice." Calvin let the words hang in the air. He had no HOA. He had bought his house outright, independent of any association, and the deed in his safe proved it. "Violations," Calvin repeated slowly. "That's funny. Because last I checked, my name's on the deed, and I don't answer to anyone's HOA. The second man, shorter with a wiry build, smirked. "That's where you're wrong. Maplewood Estates is under HOA jurisdiction. You're out of compliance. Unauthorized garage addition, non-standard fencing, failure to maintain approved lawn height." Calvin's jaw tightened. His garage had passed every inspection. His lawn was trimmed weekly. And non-standard fencing was just the wooden posts he put up to keep stray dogs out of his garden. "You boys are barking up the wrong tree," he said evenly. "Now get off my property." The threats begin. The bald man didn't budge. He leaned forward, voice low and menacing. "This isn't a request. You don't fix these violations, the board moves to eviction. That garage? Comes down. That fence? Gone. You? Out." Calvin chuckled under his breath. Not because it was funny, but because he recognized the smell of a hustle when it walked up his drive. He dealt with hustlers all his life. "You got a badge number?" he asked. "A precinct? A county office?" Silence. The shorter man shifted uncomfortably. "That's what I thought," Calvin said. "Now you got about 5 seconds to clear off before I call the sheriff for impersonating officers." The bald man narrowed his eyes. "You don't know who you're dealing with, old man." Calvin stepped forward, closing the distance. His 6'2" frame towered over the wiry man. His voice was quiet, but each syllable landed like a hammer. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. Two fools in knockoff uniforms, trying to scare people into handing over money. Not today." The men hesitated, then muttered curses as they retreated to their SUV parked at the curb. The vehicle bore a magnetic decal that read HOA Security, but Calvin could see the edges peeling where it had been slapped on. They sped off, gravel spitting under their tires. Calvin exhaled slowly, but the calm was short-lived. Neighbors in fear. That evening, Denise Johnson from across the street came knocking. She was a retired schoolteacher in her 60s, soft-spoken but sharp-eyed. "Calvin, did those men come by here today?" she asked, wringing her hands. "They did. They came to me last week. Said I owed back dues. I've never even been in an HOA, Calvin. But they waved papers, stamped and everything, saying they could put a lien on my house. Calvin frowned. Did you pay them? Her silence was answer enough. I didn't know what to do, she whispered. They said if I didn't, the sheriff would come. Calvin felt his stomach knot. This wasn't just about him, they were working the whole neighborhood. By Friday, word spread, other families had been approached. Some had paid. Others lived in fear, blinds drawn, lights off. The fake HOA cops patrolled at night, their SUV cruising slowly, headlights cutting across driveways. Calvin's resolve. Saturday morning, Calvin sat on his porch with his son Marcus, a college sophomore home for the weekend. Marcus scrolled on his phone, jaw tight. Dad, you seen this? They set up a website. Maplewood HOA Security Division. They're telling people to pay fines online. Calvin shook his head. Scam. Plain and simple. Yeah, but people are buying it. Denise told me she gave him $300. Calvin's eyes hardened. He took a sip of coffee, then set the cup down with deliberate care. Son, some men think they can rule by fear. They dress it up with fake badges and fancy words. But fear only works if good folks bow to it. You hear me? Marcus nodded slowly. Then we don't bow, Calvin said. The escalation. The following week, things grew bolder. One night Calvin awoke to a loud crack outside. He rushed to the porch, shotgun in hand, and saw his mailbox lying shattered in the street. Spray painted across it, in sloppy red letters, were the words, "Get out." The SUV idled at the end of the cul-de-sac, lights off. Calvin could feel eyes watching him. He raised the shotgun, not to fire, but to let them know he wasn't afraid. The SUV sped off into the night. The next morning, neighbors gathered by the wrecked mailbox. Fear buzzed in their voices. Some whispered about selling. Others muttered that Calvin had become a target because he refused to comply. They want to make an example of me, Calvin said, voice calm but firm. Well, let 'em try. The call for backup. That night, Calvin sat at his kitchen table, flipping through an old photo album. Inside were snapshots of men in fatigues, arms slung around each other, smiles despite the mud on their faces. His late father, broad and proud, standing tall in his uniform. Calvin picked up the phone. He scrolled to a contact labeled Nate, Seal. When the line connected, a gravelly voice answered. Cal, it's been a while. Too long, Calvin said. I wouldn't call unless it mattered. What's going on? Calvin explained everything. The fake cops, the intimidation, the fear spreading through Maplewood. When he finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then Nate spoke. Send me an address. I'll bring a couple of the boys. The storm brewing. By the weekend, Calvin knew the game had changed. The SUV circled again, but this time he didn't watch alone. His son Marcus sat beside him, jaw tight, fists clenched. And somewhere in the distance, a convoy was on the road. Nate and two other SEAL veterans Calvin hadn't seen in years, men who understood what it meant to face down threats without blinking. The imposters thought they had Maplewood under their thumb. They thought fear was their greatest weapon. But they had made one mistake too many. Because now, Calvin Brooks wasn't just one man on a porch. He was a man with history, with friends forged in fire, and with a community ready to stand behind him once someone lit the spark. And that spark had just been struck. Saturday evening settled over Maplewood with a heavy Georgia sky. Clouds gathered low and gray, thunder muttering somewhere far off. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes when people are afraid to sit on their porches. Curtains stayed drawn. Cars sat idle in driveways, as if their owners hoped invisibility might protect them. But on Calvin Brooks Street, things were about to change. At exactly 7:30, a black pickup rolled down the cul-de-sac, its headlights washing across Calvin's house. The truck slowed, then parked at the curb. When the driver's door opened, Calvin felt the years collapse. Out stepped Nate Lawson, tall, broad-chested, his beard flecked with gray. Brother, Calvin said, stepping off the porch. Brother, Nate echoed, pulling him into a hug that cracked Calvin's ribs. Two more doors opened. First came Louis Vega, wiry and sharp-eyed, a man whose silence carried weight. Then Marcus Stone, the largest of the three, with hands like bare paws and a laugh that once echoed in barracks across the globe. The seals had arrived. Old bonds, new battles. Inside the house, Calvin poured glasses of sweet tea. The four men sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Calvin had once tried to ignore the harassment. But tonight, it felt like a command center. Nate spread out a map of the neighborhood. "So walk us through it, Cal." Calvin laid it out. The first visit, the bogus violations, the smashed mailbox, the late-night SUV patrols. Marcus, Calvin's son, leaned against the doorway, his arms crossed tight. He spoke with the kind of controlled anger only youth can carry. "They think they can scare us," Marcus said. "But they don't know my dad. They don't know who he rolls with." Louis finally spoke. "They picked the wrong man." Calvin shook his head. "This isn't just about me. They've already shaken down Denise, the Hendersons, probably more. This whole block is walking on eggshells. That's how hustlers work. They spread fear until no one fights back." Stone leaned forward, his deep voice like gravel. "So we fight back." The recon. That night, instead of hiding behind curtains, the men went out. They walked the neighborhood, greeting families, listening to their stories. Mrs. Henderson showed them the fake invoice she'd been handed, complete with an official-looking seal that dissolved into a blurry photocopy when examined closely. Denise described how the men had circled her house at midnight, radios squawking, as if daring her to come outside. A younger couple whispered that they'd been told they'd lose their home if they didn't pay fines for unauthorized paint colors. Every story stacked the weight higher. Nate scribbled notes, snapped photos, collected copies of letters. "Document everything," he told neighbors. "Every paper, every visit, every threat. Don't throw anything away." For the first time in months, people didn't just whisper. They spoke. And as they spoke, Calvin saw something stirring behind their fear, anger. The patrol. Around midnight, the familiar SUV rolled into the cul-de-sac. Its headlights swept across Calvin's yard, then slowed. But this time, Calvin wasn't alone on his porch. Nate, Louis, and Stone sat beside him, arms crossed, silent and steady. Marcus leaned against the rail, filming with his phone. The SUV idled at the end of the drive. The bald man from before leaned out the passenger window. "You're out late, Brooks." Calvin didn't flinch. "So are you." The man sneered. "We told you, this neighborhood has rules." Nate rose, unfolding to his full height. "And I told you, you're on private property. That badge on your sleeve? Means nothing. You want to test that theory, step out of the car." The wiry driver shifted uncomfortably. The bald one muttered something under his breath, then the SUV revved and pulled away. Calvin exhaled, tension rolling off his shoulders. "They'll be back." "Good," Stone said, cracking his knuckles. "Let 'em." Rallying the block. The next morning, Calvin and his allies called a neighborhood meeting. For the first time in months, families stepped out of their houses, gathering in Calvin's yard. Fear still lingered, but curiosity and defiance outweighed it. Nate spoke first. "Listen up. What you're dealing with isn't a homeowners association. It's a scam. These men are pretending to be cops, pretending to be law. They're using fear to steal your money. And the only reason they get away with it is because you let them." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Louis raised a folder thick with documents. "We're building a case. With your help, we can take them down. But we need witnesses. We need proof." Denise raised her hand. "If I speak up, they'll come after me harder." Calvin stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. "Then they'll have to go through me. And they can't scare me off my own porch." Something shifted in the crowd. Heads nodded. Fear gave way to solidarity. Escalation. That night, the imposters escalated. Not just one SUV, but two, cruising the streets. Their radios crackled louder, their headlights lingered longer. At one point, they parked at the entrance to the cul-de-sac, blocking the road as if to claim ownership. But instead of retreating, Calvin and his allies walked straight toward them. The bald man stepped out this time, baton tapping against his leg. "You're making a mistake, Brooks." Calvin stood tall, Nate and Stone flanking him. Louis lifted his phone, recording. "The mistake," Calvin said evenly, "is thinking you can wear a fake badge and bully families in my neighborhood." "You think you're tough," the man snarled. We've got authority. Nate smirked. Authority? Son, I've seen real authority. And it doesn't look like you. For a long moment, tension vibrated in the humid night air. Then the imposters backed into their SUVs and drove off, tires squealing. A community awakens. The next day, news spread fast. Word of the confrontation leaked through the neighborhood, and whispers turned into conversations. Families who once hid behind curtains now sat on porches again. Children played in driveways. The imposters had tried to intimidate one man, but now the whole block was watching. Marcus uploaded clips of the SUV standoff to social media. Within hours, the video gained traction. Comments poured in, fake cops, clear as day. That's impersonation. Somebody call the sheriff. And somebody did. The sheriff arrives. 2 days later, Sheriff Daniels himself drove into Maplewood Estates, summoned by the growing complaints. He was a heavy-set man with sunburned cheeks, skeptical by nature. Calvin met him at the driveway. Sheriff, I appreciate you coming. Daniels adjusted his hat. Got half a dozen calls about fake cops. What am I looking at? Nate stepped forward, handing him a folder. Documentation. Photos, letters, fake invoices, recordings. They're running a racket. The sheriff flipped through, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. This is serious. It's harassment, Calvin said. It's fraud. And it's about to get worse if someone doesn't put a stop to it. Daniels looked up, eyes narrowing. You leave this with me. I'll run it through the DA's office. For the first time in weeks, Calvin felt the weight shift. The fight wasn't over, but momentum was turning. The line drawn. That night, as rain drummed against the roof, Calvin sat on his porch with Nate, Lewis, and Stone. Marcus hovered nearby, restless but hopeful. They'll come harder now, Nate said. Scammers don't fold easy. Calvin nodded. Then let 'em come. I'm not moving. Not for them. Not for anybody. He looked out at the cul-de-sac, where porch lights glowed like watchfires in the dark. For the first time in months, Maplewood felt less like a battlefield and more like a community again. But he knew the storm wasn't over. The imposters had tasted control, and men like that didn't give it up without a fight. The days that followed Sheriff Daniels' visit should have brought peace, but instead they brought a storm. The fake HOA enforcers, emboldened, cornered, and desperate, doubled down. Their SUVs prowled the streets more aggressively than ever, their radios hissing static and half-coded chatter. They began parking deliberately in front of Calvin's house, lights blazing into his windows until late at night. Every gesture screamed defiance, as if daring him to step outside. Calvin didn't flinch. He'd lived through too many battles, both on foreign soil and on his own front porch, to let scare tactics shake him. Still, he couldn't ignore the tension it sowed in his family. Marcus paced constantly, checking locks, filming from the windows. His wife Angela tried to mask her worry, but her eyes lingered too long on every passing car. The neighbors felt it too. Some spoke bravely about resisting, but Calvin knew fear still coiled tight in their stomachs. Fear was what the imposters thrived on. Late one evening, just as dusk swallowed Maplewood in shades of purple and gray, the imposters struck more boldly. A heavy fist pounded on Calvin's door, rattling the frame. When he opened it, 2 of them stood there, one with the shaved head, the other wiry and twitchy, both wearing the same counterfeit patches that looked more laughable under close light. You've been real mouthy, Brooks, the bald one sneered. Sheriff might be sniffing around, but you and I both know small-town law don't move fast. We own this block until somebody proves otherwise. Calvin held his ground, voice calm, even as adrenaline thrummed through him. You don't own anything. This land, this house, this street, it belongs to the people who live here, not to hustlers hiding behind fake badges. The wiry one leaned forward, spitting his words like venom. You're forgetting something, old man. We can make life real uncomfortable. Maybe your car ends up totaled. Maybe your wife gets followed to work. Maybe your boy has an accident one night. You really want to test us? The temperature in the air seemed to drop. Calvin's fists clenched at his sides, but before he could speak, Marcus appeared behind him, phone raised, filming. Say that again, Marcus demanded, his young voice shaking with fury. Say it for the camera. The imposters faltered, realizing their threats had been captured. The bald one shoved a finger toward Marcus. "Turn that off, or you'll regret it." "Not happening," Marcus said, his voice steadier now. Calvin stepped between them, his presence commanding. "You're done here. Get off my porch before I drag you off." The men hesitated, then backed away with muttered curses, disappearing into the night. But Calvin knew this wasn't retreat. This was escalation. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through Maplewood. By morning, neighbors were at Calvin's house again, some frightened, some furious, all looking for leadership. Denise clutched her husband's arm, her voice trembling as she spoke. "If they threaten your family, they'll threaten all of us. What do we do?" Calvin looked around at the faces, families who had once been strangers but were now bound by a shared enemy. "We stop hiding," he said simply. "If they want to scare us, we show them we are not afraid. Strength isn't in one man standing alone. It's in all of us standing together." That evening, Maplewood changed. Instead of shuttered windows, porches filled with neighbors talking openly. Lights stayed on late. People walked dogs, kids played basketball in driveways, laughter returned to the air. It was subtle, but powerful. The imposters thrived on silence, and now silence was gone. The scammers noticed. The following night, the SUVs came back, this time 3 of them, engines growling, headlights blinding. They crept slowly down the street like predators stalking prey. Families didn't scatter. They stood in their yards, phones raised, filming. Calvin and his old SEAL brothers waited at the center of it all, calm but coiled like springs. The bald imposter climbed out again, baton in hand, rage etched into every line of his face. "You think you're clever, Brooks? You think your little army of neighbors scares us? You don't know who you're dealing with." Calvin stepped forward, his voice carrying across the street. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with: thieves, liars, and cowards. And cowards don't last long when the truth's on their heels." The imposter's face darkened, and with a sudden roar, he swung the baton. It came fast, aimed at Calvin's ribs, but before it landed, a massive hand caught his wrist. Stone, the largest of the SEALs, stood there with a grip like iron. Slowly, deliberately, he squeezed until the man dropped the baton with a yelp. "You picked the wrong man to swing at," Stone growled. The wiry imposter lunged, but Lewis was faster. A quick sidestep, a twist of the arm, and the man was face first in the grass, gasping for breath. Chaos erupted. Neighbors screamed, some rushing forward, others holding their phones high. The remaining imposters in the SUVs revved engines, honking horns, trying to intimidate, but the balance had shifted. For the first time, the community wasn't shrinking, it was rising. Sheriff Daniels arrived minutes later, lights flashing, deputies piling out. The imposters tried to scatter, but too many witnesses, too much evidence, too many cameras caught every detail. Deputies pinned 2 of the men down while others fled into the night. Daniels looked at Calvin, breathless but steady, surrounded by neighbors who were no longer afraid. "You weren't exaggerating," the sheriff muttered, shaking his head. "I told you," Calvin replied. "They're not here to enforce law. They're here to break it." Deputies loaded the imposters into cruisers. For a moment, it felt like the battle was over. But deep down, Calvin knew this was only the first clash. These men had resources, connections, and desperation that wouldn't vanish overnight. The fight for Maplewood had only begun. That night, Calvin stood on his porch, looking out at the street where families still lingered, trading stories, checking on one another. He felt pride, but also weight. The imposters had crossed the line into violence, and next time, it might be worse. But if they thought fear would break him, they were wrong. He turned to Marcus, who stood beside him with determination blazing in his eyes. "This isn't just about us anymore," Calvin said quietly. "It's about every neighborhood that's ever been pushed around, every family that's been bullied. We are not fighting for one street, we are fighting for the principle of home." Marcus nodded. "Then we don't stop until it's done." Calvin looked back at the dark road where flashing lights had just faded, and he made a silent vow. No imposter, no fake cop, no scam artist would ever own his community again. The war for Maplewood was far from finished, but one truth was clear: the neighborhood was no longer afraid. And neither was he. The quiet that followed the arrests lasted only a few days. For a brief moment, Maplewood tasted peace again. Children played on lawns, neighbors waved without glancing over their shoulders, and Calvin allowed himself to believe maybe, just maybe, the worst had passed. But in his gut, he knew better. Bullies rarely disappeared after one defeat. They regrouped, they schemed, and they came back sharper. It began with shadows. Late-night footsteps scraping across driveways, car doors slamming in the early hours, the unsettling sense of being watched. Marcus swore he saw the bald imposter's SUV circling the neighborhood again, even though Calvin knew the man had been released on bail. That meant others, still free, still angry, had stepped into the role. The machine hadn't stopped, it had simply oiled its gears. Then came the property damage. One morning, Denise woke to find her front window shattered, a rock lying among the shards. A crude note was taped to her door, "Leave, or you'll wish you had." Another family discovered nails scattered across their driveway, tires punctured. Angela found scorch marks near the corner of her garage, as though someone had poured gasoline but chickened out before striking a match. The escalation rattled the neighborhood. For all the courage they had shown, the residents of Maplewood were still ordinary people. Teachers, mechanics, retirees, parents. They weren't soldiers. They hadn't trained for war. Calvin felt the weight pressing heavier than ever. His porch became a gathering place nightly, neighbors coming to vent, to strategize, to ask questions he couldn't always answer. What if they burn our houses down? What if the sheriff can't stop them? What if they never leave? Calvin's answer was always steady, though inside his chest his heart hammered with the same fears. We don't let them win. If they think we'll scatter, they'll only grow bolder. We stand together, no matter how loud they get. He doubled his patrols, walking the street with Stone and Lewis, keeping watch through the long hours of the night. Marcus and some of the younger neighbors created a rotation, filming cars that lingered too long, logging license plates, sending everything to Sheriff Daniels. The sheriff, for his part, kept his promise, but it was clear his department was stretched thin. Every time he tried to move forward with charges, some judge or county clerk slowed the process, files delayed, hearings postponed. It smelled of influence, someone higher up pulling strings. One evening, Daniels met Calvin on his porch, fatigue etched deep into his face. "I'll be honest with you, Brooks. These men have friends in places I don't like. They've been running scams across the county for years, hiding behind fake paperwork, buying silence where they can. You and your neighbors were just the first to stand up. Now they're desperate to make an example out of you." Calvin leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "So what do we do?" Daniels exhaled, scanning the dark street. "We build a case so airtight no one can wiggle free. But that takes time. Meanwhile, you need to keep your people safe. And that might get ugly." Ugly came sooner than either expected. It was a Friday night when Maplewood erupted into chaos. Calvin was sitting with Angela on the porch, trying to enjoy the coolness of evening, when the roar of engines shattered the calm. 4 SUVs barreled down the street, lights off, tires squealing. They swerved wildly, spraying gravel, and screeched to a stop in front of his house. Doors flew open, and masked men spilled out, bottles in hand, Molotov cocktails. Calvin's blood ran cold. "Inside, now," he barked to Angela, shoving her toward the door. He bolted down the steps just as the first bottle smashed against his mailbox, flames licking high. Neighbors screamed, children cried, porch lights snapped on across the block. Stone and Lewis, already on alert, charged from across the street. One of the masked men lit another bottle, but Stone tackled him to the ground before he could throw. Lewis intercepted another, twisting his arm until the glass slipped harmlessly to the pavement. Calvin grabbed a garden hose and sprayed down the flames, the acrid smoke burning his eyes. Marcus appeared beside him with a fire extinguisher, dousing the last embers. The imposters scrambled back into their SUVs, engines revving, gravel spitting as they fled into the night. The whole attack lasted less than 3 minutes, but its impact was seismic. Neighbors emerged from their homes shaken, voices trembling as they recounted what they had seen. Sheriff's cruisers arrived within minutes, lights flashing red and blue, sirens cutting through the smoke. Deputies fanned out, collecting bottles, photographing scorch marks, interviewing residents. Sheriff Daniels himself approached Calvin, jaw tight. "This isn't harassment anymore," he said grimly. "This is attempted arson." domestic terrorism. They just crossed a line even the dirtiest judge can't ignore. But Calvin saw the fear in his neighbors' eyes. Some whispered about leaving, about selling their homes before things escalated further. He couldn't blame them. People moved to Maplewood for peace, not war. Yet if they left, the imposters would win, not just here, but everywhere they tried their scheme. That night, Calvin called a meeting in his backyard. Dozens of residents crowded under strings of lights, faces drawn but resolute. He stood before them, voice steady, carrying the weight of every word. "They want to burn us out, to scare us into running," he said. "But I didn't fight for this country overseas just to come home and surrender to cowards. This is our neighborhood. Our homes. Our families. If we give it up now, what do we tell our kids? That fear decides who gets to live where? Not tonight. Not ever." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling. Marcus looked around, pride glowing in his eyes. Denise wiped away tears. Even the most frightened neighbors stood taller, drawing courage from the man who refused to bend. From that night on, Maplewood became something new. Patrol shifts turned formal, walkie-talkies buzzed with check-ins, and neighbors carried whistles to sound alarms. The SEAL veterans trained residents in basic defense, teaching them to stay calm under pressure, to work as a team. Families who had barely spoken before now broke bread together, forming bonds stronger than fear. But the imposters weren't finished. As charges piled up and evidence mounted, they grew reckless. Some tried to smear Calvin online, spreading lies about him being a criminal, a squatter, a fraud. Others leaned on local officials, trying to stall the court case. Rumors flew that they had ties to organized crime, that they weren't just rogue hustlers but part of a larger racket feeding off small communities across Georgia. For Calvin, the truth became clear. This fight was bigger than Maplewood. It was about exposing the rot behind the imposters, dragging their network into the light. And if that meant being the target, he was ready. The breaking point came one stormy night, rain hammering roofs, lightning splitting the sky. Calvin awoke to a crash outside, his truck's windshield shattered, tires slashed. He rushed out, rain soaking through his clothes, and there they were again. The imposters, standing in the downpour, grinning like specters. One of them shouted over the thunder, "This ends when you leave, Brooks. Walk away, or you'll leave in a body bag." Calvin stared at them, unflinching, rain running down his face. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, voice carrying through the storm. "And neither are my people." The imposters retreated into the dark, but Calvin knew what was coming next. They were building to something final, something violent, something meant to crush his spirit once and for all. Yet as he looked back at the glowing windows of Maplewood, where families huddled but refused to run, Calvin felt no fear. He felt only resolve. The battle was entering its final chapter. And this time, the whole county would be watching. The storm that had raged over Maplewood finally broke into clear skies the following morning, but no one mistook the sun for peace. Everyone in the neighborhood knew something was coming, something final. The imposters had run out of intimidation tricks, and the failed arson had pushed law enforcement into high gear. Now it wasn't just Calvin's fight, it was the county's. The sheriff's office coordinated with state investigators, building a case brick by brick. Still, danger lingered. Patrols continued. Neighbors still jumped at shadows. And Calvin, though unbowed, carried the weight of their hope like a mantle across his shoulders. He didn't sleep much. Nights were spent reviewing video footage with Marcus, talking strategy with Stone and Lewis, meeting with Sheriff Daniels, and calming neighbors who were one bad scare away from selling their homes and fleeing. Finally, the day came, arraignment hearings for the imposters. 4 of them were charged: arson, assault, impersonating officers, racketeering. Calvin arrived at the courthouse in downtown Augusta with his family, his SEAL brothers, and half of Maplewood marching beside him. The sight was unforgettable, a line of ordinary citizens, black and white, young and old, standing shoulder to shoulder against a group of frauds who had tried to tear them apart. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Reporters filled the back rows. Deputies stood at every door. The imposters shuffled in, wrists bound, their cocky swagger gone. The bald leader's face was swollen from his arrest scuffle. The wiry one's eyes darted nervously, searching for an escape that didn't exist. The prosecutor laid out the case with precision. Video footage of the threats, eyewitness accounts of the arson attempt, forged documents seized from their SUVs. Each detail stripped away the imposters' facade, revealing them as nothing more than criminals with delusions of power. When it was Calvin's turn to testify, the courtroom held its breath. He walked to the stand with measured steps, his frame steady, his voice calm but carrying. He spoke of the first smashed mailbox, the midnight threats, the knock at his door where they promised accidents for his family. He spoke of the flames licking his mailbox, the fear in children's eyes, the nights neighbors stood guard instead of sleeping. But he also spoke of unity, of strangers who became brothers and sisters, of a street that learned courage is contagious. They wanted to own us through fear, Calvin said, his eyes sweeping the jury. But what they did was remind us that fear only loses its grip when people stand together. We didn't choose this fight, but we chose not to run. That's the difference. The defense tried to paint the imposters as misunderstood volunteers, men who only wanted to protect the neighborhood. The jury didn't buy it. Too much evidence. Too many lives disrupted. Too many lies exposed. The trial stretched for days, but the verdict came swiftly, guilty on all major counts. The imposters slumped in their seats as sentencing loomed, years behind bars for crimes they thought would never catch up to them. When the gavel fell, Maplewood erupted in relief. Neighbors hugged, cried, clapped each other on the back. Sheriff Daniels shook Calvin's hand, his voice rough with respect. You did more than stand your ground, Brooks. You gave this whole county a backbone. But for Calvin, it wasn't about glory. It was about restoring peace to the people who deserved it. That night, Maplewood held a block party unlike any before. Tables of food stretched across lawns, kids played late under string lights, music filled the air. The same street once stalked by imposters now pulsed with joy, laughter, and pride. Angela leaned into Calvin's side, her eyes soft. It's over, she whispered. Calvin looked out at the crowd, Marcus tossing a football with neighbors, Denise laughing freely for the first time in months, Stone and Lewis swapping stories with young men eager to learn from them. It's never really over, he said quietly. There will always be someone trying to push people down. But as long as we stand together, they'll never win. Marcus came up, grinning. You were incredible in court, Dad. You shut them down. Calvin chuckled. I didn't shut them down. The truth did. And truth always finds its way. Later that evening, as the party wound down and the stars came out, Calvin stood on his porch once more. The air was still, the kind of stillness that comes only after chaos. He thought back to that first night, the dented mailbox, the SUV headlights in the dark. How far they'd come since then. How much had been risked, endured, and won. And he thought about legacy. Not the kind written in history books, but the kind that lived in quiet courage, in communities that refused to bend, in families who chose to fight for what was right rather than yield to what was easy. The imposters were gone, locked away. Their scheme shattered. Their arrogance punished. But the real victory was Maplewood itself, stronger than ever, bound not by fear but by solidarity. Calvin smiled faintly, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. He whispered to himself, almost like a prayer, home means something again. And with that, the story of Maplewood closed, not with flames or fear, but with light.